Hello and welcome back to our kitchen. Today I'm going to show you how I make our sourdough bread loaves. Now, sourdough is really special because there's a way in which the grains ferment in this process that makes it much better for you. In fact, all of the nutrients in the grains are somehow fermented to actually make it easier for your body to consume and digest. So, sourdough is the way to go. And it's totally worth learning about this bread making process. Now, I get my recipe from this bread book, which is by a bread maker in Oregon who is really passionate about bread making, but also about making bread that actually tastes really good. So instead of a quick bread recipe, his recipes are more explaining the process behind what is happening so that you can manipulate the taste and actually do some experiments to enhance your bread flavor and texture and so on. Now, that is high up of the expert level and I'm definitely not there yet. In fact, it took me a really long time to even start making bread because it seems very intimidating, but it really isn't, and I hope to make it really simple for you in this video. And I'm going to show you how I feed my sourdough starter, which is right here, and how I actually bake the bread. So right now it's 9 o'clock in the morning for me, and I'm going to feed my sourdough starter before I actually mix my bread later on. And you should know that I fed this sourdough starter about 24 hours ago. Why that's important is because basically this little sour animal, if you want to call it that, has been fed. So it is active and ready for use. That's important because if I had just taken this straight out of the fridge, it would kind of be in a dormant stage. So it's important to know that I had just fed it 24 hours ago and I'm about to give it another feeding just so that it is ready for bread making. So let me show you how I do that. Now to feed it, I'm going to be getting rid of nearly most of it. And the idea behind that is, let's say this is a child, and this child is 2 years old. Follow me on this analogy. A 2-year-old would eat a lot more than, say, a 1-year-old or a 6-month-old baby. So if I feed this sourdough starter right now, I'm going to need to feed it as much as a 2-year-old needs to eat. I don't want to keep using my flour to feed this child that is just going to grow and grow and grow, and at some point I need to feed it many cups of flour. I don't want to do that. I want to keep it small so that I can feed it only little bits of flour to keep it active. Of course, anytime I'm not going to feed this child, I'm going to put it in the fridge, basically put a pause on the child. Good kind of child to have. I'm sure many parents out there are like, yes, pause my child. Anyway, so I'm going to take this 2-year-old child sourdough starter animal, and I'm gonna bring it back to, let's say, a 6-month-old state. So how I do that is I keep everything that I'm discarding in a container like this in my fridge, and I can use it for a whole bunch of other recipes like pancakes and crackers and bagels, and people make all kinds of stuff with this sourdough discard. Or you can throw it away. But I am not throwing it away, I am keeping it. This is roughly what it looks like. And I'm just going to scoop it into my bucket. Alright, now to know how much I should be getting rid of here, I'm gonna go to the recipe, and it's telling me after 24 hours of previous feeding of leaven, discard all but 100 grams of the leaven, leaving the remainder in your tub. So 100. Now I know that my container weighs 458 milliliters because I weighed it before I even started the sourdough starter, and so I will leave about 558 milliliters in here, which is 100 grams as per the recipe. And I'm just going to keep this back into my fridge. Next, I'm going to be adding, according to the recipe, 400 grams of white flour and 100 grams of whole wheat flour. So this is my 400 grams of white flour. Oops, and when I do way too much, just grab a spoon, spoon it out. Perfect. And 100 grams of whole wheat flour. Right. Next, the recipe calls for 400 milliliters of warm water, around 85 to 90 Fahrenheit. Now you could measure with a thermometer, and I suggest if you're new to bread baking, you do measure the temperature of your water. I've done this plenty of times, so I just kind of know already what to feel for in the water. So get some water. Alright, and I'm adding 400 milliliters of water. And then I'm just going to mix it in with my hand. Now the consistency that this mixture is going to end up with is pretty close to what the final bread mix is going to be. So my starter kind of remains the consistency that my bread mix will be. It's not very important, but it is definitely helpful for later on. Alright. And that is it for my feeding. I just usually clean off my fingers with a knife. And then I'm going to let this sit out for a couple of hours. Now you're most likely going to forget to come back to this later. So, well, maybe you're better than me and you'll remember, but I have just found it much easier to set myself an alarm. Alright, so according to this recipe, I'm going to be mixing the actual bread dough 7 to 9 hours later. So let's just say, for time's sake, to make it easy, 5 o'clock tonight, I'm going to be mixing my sourdough loaf. So I'm going to put a reminder in my phone for 10 minutes to 5 so that I remember to actually mix my dough. Hello everyone and welcome back. So my alarm just went off and it's time for me to mix my bread. So what I'm going to do first is get an empty bucket. I'm going to leave my sourdough starter in the bucket that it's already in and mix my bread in a clean one. Now you can use any bowl that you have, a mixing bowl is fine, glass or plastic container that you have. And where is my flour? I have not unpacked our flour order into a easier scooping mechanism yet, but this will have to do for now. So the recipe calls for 804 grams of white flour. Start there. Sure your scale is zeroed. 804 milliliters, which we said earlier is the same as grams. Now, this recipe will give you 2 loaves, so if you're just wanting to bake one, just half it. Next, I'm adding 50 grams of rye flour and 26 grams of whole wheat flour. I just use 26 grams of whole wheat flour, and then for the rye flour, which I don't have, I substitute with einkorn flour, just because it's got a really nice taste. Flavor, the bread tastes really good, so. And then with my flour, I'm going to be adding in 648 grams of water, which is at that same temperature that you saw earlier, 90 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, or lukewarm water. Start that up. hand. And now I'm going to cover this lid and let it sit for about 20 to 30 minutes, however much time you have. Bread bakers say that this is a really important step to let the flour and the water kind of first have their chance to gel together. Although many people skip this step and still have success, so I don't really know what all that's about. Wait, so I actually went and researched what this step is all about. And this autolyze process is really important because it is allowing the water to mix with the flour in order to make the flour more absorbent to liquid. So this is really important for the bread process. While I wait for that, I use this opportunity to measure out the rest of my recipe ingredients, which will be some salt and this sourdough that I fed earlier. So for the salt, I grabbed a little bowl, and the recipe calls for 22 grams of salt. Just like that. And then for this sourdough, to weigh it out, the book recommends that you add a little bit of water to the bottom of a bowl. Zero in your scale. And then I wet my hand with whatever water I've got left over. And I'm grabbing some of this sourdough starter. I'll tell you how much. 260 grams. So that is a bit too much. If it's a few grams over, it's fine. That's right about spot on. And now I have the last ingredients ready for when we're back in about 20 minutes. Alright, it's been about 20-ish minutes, so let's mix the rest of our dough. So I'm going to sprinkle the salt kind of evenly, and then add in my sourdough starter. Now I'm using this water to wet my hand, and I'm going to mix it, kind of pulling the edges and folding it over. Once you've folded that a couple times over, you also want to pinch the dough and then fold again. And that pinch just helps get everything mixed in really well. Once you folded it over a couple of times, you can use that pincher method once again. I pinch it about 4 or 5 times, however many your hand can handle. And then again, just fold them over. This mixing should take you roughly 3, 4, 5-ish minutes. So go slow and take time with it. Now, when you feel like you've given it a good mix, step away for a minute. Oh, you don't have to close the lid. That's just a habit. Just step away for a minute. You'll see the dough is kind of settling, and then just give it one more good old mix, starting with the pincher method, and then folding over. This is gonna rise overnight, so I'm gonna close the lid and let it sit on my counter here overnight. This recipe calls for 3 folds throughout the evening into tomorrow morning. I may do one just before we have dinner, another one a few hours before we go to bed, and then the final fold just before we go to sleep. Alright, now it's very late. Walter has done the first 2 folds for me, but I'm going to show you the last fold here. So I just wet my hand, and then I do a basic kind of put my hand underneath, pull it over, just around the entire bucket once. Pull it out, flip it, pull it out, flip it. Until it looks something like that. And then we'll be ready to divide the loaves tomorrow morning. To shape these loaves. It's important to shape the loaves because it tightens up your loaf, kind of makes it firm, and gives it a nice enclosure for those layers to stay compact in there. All the gluten structures to remain. We want those gases to stay kind of in a bubble so that it bakes well and doesn't fall flat. So I'm just going to reach underneath, pull out a layer and fold it over until I've done that all the way around the loaf. The bottom of this dough is on a floured surface and my hand is floured, so as long as I'm working with the outside edges of the dough, it shouldn't be too sticky. And then I'm lifting this dough onto a different section of the counter that is not floured. Now from here, I'm going to, with the edges of my fingers, kind of pull the dough toward me, twist, and pull it again, twist. And this will, over time, tighten up this dough into a nice ball that you'll feel is kind of firmer and holds its end up a little bit better. If you're feeling that it's kind of getting stuck, I just flour the edges of my hands and keep on pulling, twisting, for a couple of times, I guess more than a couple, about several turns, just until you kind of feel this loaf is speaking to you and it is firmed up. And then I grab a basket with a dishcloth, lace that with some flour just so the dough doesn't get stuck, and then I plop my dough right into it, and it's gonna rest here for the next couple of hours. About 4 hours to be exact. Now around the 4-hour mark, I'm gonna come and do a finger dent test. Now when I poke the loaf, if the dough does not jump back at me, I know that it is ready. If I poke the loaf and it is jumping back at me right away, I know that it is not fully proofed yet. That's what this process is called, the proofing process. So you gotta do a little bit of planning ahead of time because you're gonna wanna start your oven about a half an hour before you plan to bake so that your pans can heat up. So for me, if I'm shaping these loaves around 8 in the morning, I'm gonna come and heat up my oven around 11:30 so that by noon, when my loaves are supposed to be ready, I am ready to bake them in these hot pans right away. Now you're going to want to take this bread out of here and let it cool on its side. So what I usually do is use this little thing to hold it up. You can use whatever, I use cups, anything heavy. And then you lay the bread on its side so that it can cool. I don't know why. I believe a cooling rack would work just as well, but Mr. Ken recommends that we put the bread on its side. So I'm following the expert advice and letting my bread cool on their side. And if you listen closely, you can hear that this bread is crackling. It is beautiful. Let me give you some up close looks and sounds. And that is it. This is how you bake some homemade bread. It's happened over 2 days, and really if you get the method down, you can somehow mix this into your schedule. You can adjust it by starting an hour or two earlier or later, however works for your schedule, depending on when you go to work, when you're back, when you go to sleep. Just get the system down and then adjust the timing so that it works for your schedule. But guys, it is so easy to bake bread. It isn't all that intimidating as it is made out to be. So go ahead and try it, and trust me, the result is so good. You don't feel horrible after eating a slice of this sourdough bread. In fact, I feel full. I feel like it has actually nourished my body, given me a good meal, a filling meal, and I know that there is a lot of nutrients that I am able to now absorb due to this sourdough process that has fermented the grains for me. I'm really happy to have found a recipe. Thank you so much, Mr. Ken Forkish, for your book. I use it so much that I don't even have the cover on here. And it is actually laminated just to keep because I use it so much. But I can highly recommend this book if you want to learn more about the bread making process and what all is going on chemically with each ingredient as it ferments and mixes together, but also just the ability to be able to manipulate certain steps in order to change the flavor of your bread or the taste, the size, the way it looks. And of course there's some recipes in here for a regular yeast if you don't have a sourdough starter or aren't interested in keeping one. You can find regular bread recipes in there as well. Also pizza recipes if you're interested in that. And this will be much easier to cut once you've let it cool down for a little while. If you cut it initially, the bread will be really soft and it may be a challenge to cut, but once you've given it some time, you'll see that it cuts easier. Now, if you're like me and you cannot wait after a fresh loaf, let it cut soft, it's fine. But just so you know, if you want better slices, if you leave it for a little while to cool, it will be much easier to cut. So good. Another piece. I think so. One final tip that I thought I should share with you is how to actually store this bread. Now you have just made a delicious loaf of bread, and this outer membrane will keep it fresh for a little while. Like if I left these out overnight, let's say, to cool down, it'll be alright by the next morning. It would not be stale, I guess you could say. However, if you've cut into it like I just did, you're going to want to put it in some kind of plastic bag. Now I know I also am looking for many ways where we can reduce plastic, and you know, I hate using a bag knowing that that's just going to go. Where is it going to go? I'm going to use it and it's going to go in a landfill. I know. Not a nice thought. However, you do need to use some kind of plastic, because I have tried to use some kind of bread bag that's made from material. I haven't had success with that. I've also tried putting it in a paper bag, like a brown paper bag. Haven't had success with that. So if you're going to bake this bread and you're not going to eat it quick enough, I do just suggest that you use a plastic bag to store it. Now, the grocery store where we buy groceries has recyclable plastic bags, so I don't know how they're doing that. I'm not up to speed on those kinds of things, but they are giving out plastic bags that are recyclable and biodegradable. I think that's what it is. Hey guys, so I just put my bread away and I was finally able to read this, which says biodegradable. And it says here, this bag will fragment into small pieces when exposed to oxygen or sunlight. They work perfectly for the bread. So look into alternatives. I find that that works well. So it doesn't need to be some kind of like crazy plastic, but definitely do put it in a kind of sealed environment. Now the plastic bags have holes all over them, you know, it's not totally sealed tight, and I think that that's okay. It does actually want to breathe a little bit, especially if it's just like a tiny bit hot still when you're putting it away. Definitely want it to air out so that it doesn't sweat in there and get your bread to become all moist. So just some things to think about. Now if you have stuck around throughout this entire bread process, I thank you. I really hope that he's given you lots of value and that you can see now it is not that hard to bake bread. You've been able to watch the steps play out in real time, so you can imagine how this process would go, and that you feel confident that you can now also go and bake a bread. I just wanted to show you the inside of this bread. So you can see that it is gorgeous, airy, fluffy bread. And I think it's only appropriate to end off this video with, folks, it's been a slice.